Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Buck Stops here. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, we have certainly seen major swings in the equity markets this week, and certainly it's been a very rough start to the year, no doubt about that. A lot of uncertainty in terms of the U.S. Federal Reserve and whether or not they're going to be able to combat inflation by raising rates. It was interesting to see a bit of a relief rally when they did do that, but then, of course, we saw the markets see some significant losses yesterday. So I really wanted to provide some perspective in terms of the markets, the economy, geopolitics, and where we go from here. So who better to get some advice and thoughts and insight from other than Jim Rickards. He has been in the banking business since 1976. Important to give a lot of context and history here today. And also is, of course, the editor of the financial newsletter, Strategic Intelligence. Jim, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be with you, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, why don't we first start with the U.S. Federal Reserve? That, of course, has been the big news of this week, and so much anticipation in terms of what they would do. And, you know, is it going to be the right move? I mean, is there going to be a policy mistake?
Well, there's going to be a bad ending. I wouldn't call it a policy mistake. The mistakes have already been made. And now we're at a point where we're like, okay, how do we get out of this? And, you know, I hate to use cliches, but, you know, between a rock and a hard place is probably as good as any. So the rock is a recession at best, maybe something worse, something more like a global liquidity crisis. The hard place is inflation, worse than what we're seeing already. Those are the Fed's two choices. This notion of a so-called soft landing where, you know, we can raise interest rates a little at a time and get inflation under control, but keep the economy going. That's not going to happen. We're either going to have a recession or the Fed will at some point balk, you know, not like what's going on in the markets, throw in the towel, in which case inflation will take off. Now, it's clear that Powell said, we're going to get rid of inflation. We're going to subdue inflation. We're not going to stop until that happens. Okay, that's a pretty clear direction. By the way, if you look at what Powell actually said, you got to be a little bit of a geek and watch the whole press conference and take notes and get a transcript and all that. Not the FOMC statement. That's a little bit. I know the guy who writes those. It's a little cut and dried. But what Powell actually said, it was interesting. At one point, he said the U.S. economy is in great shape. You know, worse to that effect. But that was pretty much exactly what he said, which is nonsense. It's not in great shape. The people ask me, are we going to have a recession? And my answer is we might be in a recession right now and not even know it. U.S. growth, I'm talking about the U.S., but, you know, Canada, EU, Japan, and others are not much better. We could be facing a global recession, including China, but just focusing on the U.S. Because that's the Fed's sort of territory. First quarter growth was negative 1.5%. So we have that. We have the Atlanta Fed GDP estimate of second quarter growth. Second quarter's not over. We've got a few more weeks, and we won't know the actual number until late July. But they have a pretty good track record. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best tool out there. And they're showing second quarter as zero. Well, where I went to school, negative 1.5 plus zero equals negative 1.5. In other words, you're going to have a decline in growth for the first half. Based on where we are now. Now, things are getting worse, so that zero could tip into negative, in which case you could have 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, and that is the definition of a recession. So my point being, we might be in a recession already. We'll find out, you know, later this year, but the data right now certainly points in that direction. So Powell saying, you know, the economy is great is nonsense. What he said, if you look at all of his other forecasts, he said, you know, by the end of the year, we could be looking at 4.2% unemployment, 3.5 to 4% interest rates, and, you know, kind of 2.7% inflation. You know, like, wait a second, inflation is 8.6 today. How do you get to, you know, 2.7, number one? And then what about rising unemployment and higher interest rates? How do you reconcile those things? He said all three of those things. But what state of the world could make those things come true? There's only one, which is a recession. A recession would do it. A recession will raise unemployment. Higher interest rates will cause the recession, and the recession will cause inflation to go down. So in effect, Powell was saying we're going to have a recession. And this is why Wall Street reacted the way it did. Wednesday afternoon, it rallied, but that's just algorithms and short covering and some technical factors. Thursday, it sank like a stone. But that was people getting a good night's sleep, waking up and say, wait a second, he just told us we're going to have a recession. And my point is, not only is he right, we may be in one already.
All right, Jim, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what comes next. We'll be right back. So, Jim, it's interesting to kind of hear, and you really do have to listen to what Fed Chair Jerome Powell says, not just read it. Absolutely. It's always the nuance. So that, perhaps we are in a recession, or he's at least calling for it. But I want to just ask you, one really, I think, important question, which is, they're raising rates to try to combat inflation, to, perhaps decrease demand. There's no way, though, that they can do that I don't think, really, as it relates to the price of oil and the impact that that's having around the world on economies and also individuals, and also, of course, food scarcity and potentially a food crisis in some countries. For most people, food and your energy costs are the majority of your costs to live. And, I really worry about their inability to perhaps control those aspects and what that might mean for everyday individuals and society. I mean, I know that's a big topic, but I think it's, a real one, and I think it's here.
Christine, first of all, that's exactly right. I think you pointed to exactly the issue. Now, inflation, yeah, prices go up, so we understand that, or maybe put differently, the value of your money goes down. You don't get as much for your money, same thing. But inflation, broadly speaking, has two causes. One is called, not to get too technical, but it's called cost push. This comes from the supply side. So there's a shortage of oil. And we've got a financial and economic war going on between Russia and the United States. U.S. really started, but U.S., EU, Canada, Australia, Japan versus Russia. That's obviously disrupting supply chain, cutting down energy supply, causing the price of oil to go up, et cetera. So that's coming from the supply side. And you're exactly right. The Fed can't drill for oil. The Fed can't plant wheat. The Fed can't make semiconductors. So they can't do anything about this. And the supply chains are breaking down. They were breaking down before the war in Ukraine, but Ukraine has made it worse. The other source of inflation is called demand pull. And this is when individuals, you, me, and all of our viewers and, everyday Canadians and Americans worry about inflation. We say, well, I'm just thinking about buying a refrigerator. Better buy it now before the price goes up, or the car, or house, or whatever it might be. They're different, but they affect each other. When the cost push inflation from the supply side has enough effect, there's a tipping point or critical threshold in psychology. We say, maybe it is out of control. I better go buy some stuff. Then the velocity of money goes up, and then you get inflation. So the Fed can't do anything about cost push. They can't do anything about the price of oil, and you're right about that. But they're looking at the demand side, saying, hey, if this supply thing goes on long enough, eventually the psychology will change, and we'll get demand pull and behavioral, and that is really hard to change. So what they're trying to do, they know they can't change the supply side, but they're trying to squash the demand side before it gets out of control. Now, the question, of course, is, can they do it? The answer is they can do it, but at what cost? So a general rule of thumb, this is really simple. You have to get, forget about nominal interest rates. Nominal interest rates are the rates you see on your screen, you hear about in the headlines and all that. Real interest rates are nominal interest rates minus inflation. Take the inflation out and see what's left. Well, right now, real interest rates are about 2%, actually 1.75% under the Fed's policy rate. Inflation's 8.6%. So, just round numbers, 1.5 minus 8.5, that makes the inflation rate -7. That's nowhere near. It's got to be +2. Real rates have to be +2 to squash inflation. Right now, they're -7. So that implies that the Fed has to raise interest rates to 10.5% to get to +2 real interest rates. That's never going to happen. They're never going to get there. They will destroy the economy long before they get there. So the Fed has no hope of squashing inflation from the demand side, as you described, by raising rates, unless inflation comes down for other reasons. So what they're going to do, they're going to keep raising rates, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, hope that inflation comes down from 8 to, maybe 3, although I think that's a stretch. You could get into positive real rate territory, but they're really far away from it. So I think, by the way, I described what they're trying to do. I should make it clear they're going to fail. The only way inflation comes down, the way we're talking about, is if they trash the economy, a severe recession. If that happens, yeah, you say, well, people still need to put gas in their cars. Well, you're right, but not if they're unemployed, because they're not going to work.
Yeah. A lot to pick up on. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Jim Rickards. So, Jim, you say that, look, it's going to be a really difficult aspect for the Fed to get it right, that they're going to fail. One possible reprieve could be a solution with Ukraine and Russia as it relates to the energy aspect that we're talking about. What do you say to that?
That could be a reprieve, but my view is not going to happen. It's too late for that. The time to stop the war was before it began. I've never seen a war that was easier to prevent. All that had to happen, you need some leadership, which unfortunately the U.S. is lacking. But Biden could have picked up the phone, called Zelensky. When Trump talked to Zelensky, he got impeached. But Biden could, call Zelensky and say, look, here's the deal. You have to announce that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, maybe not join the EU, remain neutral, and offer autonomy, not independence, but autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk. And if that had been conveyed to Putin, he would have said, fine, I want guarantees, I want multiple signatures on the treaty, let's do that. And you could have prevented the war. I could stop the war in 48 hours now with the same offer if I had that authority, but the White House certainly does. But with one big difference, which is Russia is not going to give back the territory they took. They fought for it. They died for it. They spent a lot of money for it. It was very brutal. They're not going to give it back. Why should they? This is, and they say, the U.S. State Department sent out an announcement last week. They said they were warning African countries not to buy wheat on Russian vessels because it was stolen from Ukraine. I was like, wait a second, there's a war going on. When you win a war, you get stuff. You get the land, you get the natural resources, you get the industrial capacity, you get the wheat. So this is like the history of war for the last 3,000 years, why I was surprised that the Russians are exporting wheat. And by the way, if you're an African leader, you're the president of Egypt or Kenya or over in the Middle East, Jordan, Lebanon, any of those countries, they get between 50 and 100% of their grain from Ukraine or Russia. Ukraine can't export because there's a war going on, and Russia can't export because of the sanctions. But either way, if a vessel, dry bulk carrier of wheat or barley shows up in your port, and your choice is, participate in the boycott or let your people starve, you're going to buy the wheat. Meaning, you should just ignore the U.S. State Department. They're pretty much out to lunch. So the point is, you can't undo that very quickly. And President Biden has said, and others, European leaders have said, the sanctions are not coming off until the Russians leave Ukraine. They've said that categorically. Well, guess what? The Russians are not leaving Ukraine. And I don't see any talks or anything that would point in the direction of ending this war anytime soon. The Russians have to consolidate their gains. U.S., Germany, Canada, all these countries are sending these very advanced weapons to Ukraine. Most of them are not getting through, by the way. There are little logistical issues, like the Ukrainian railroad and the Polish railroad run on different gauges. So you can't even run a train across the border because they're two different widths of the railroad track. The Russians have pretty good intelligence at blowing up a lot of weapons along the way. But even if you get to the front lines, they don't have ammunition. The directions are in English. They don't read English. They're using Google Translator to translate to Ukrainian. Good luck. I couldn't do it in English, but good luck to that. So a lot of this is, and they haven't actually. By the way, the oil and natural gas are still flowing. We've heard about sanctions and this and end of John Kerry flying around his private jet. It's all nonsense. Most of it's not in effect. The oil and natural gas are still flowing. Russia's getting paid by Germany, and Russia's paying transit fees to Ukraine. So the Western allies are financing the Russian side of the war. Putin's making more money than ever. And Russia's helping to finance Ukraine by paying transit fees. So there's a lot here that's just for show. It sounds good on TV, but there's a lot less here than meets the eye. But the point is, this is not over anytime soon. And even if it were, when you break supply chains, you can't just put them back together. It's like breaking a vase in 1,000 pieces, and you got to go buy a new vase. It's going to take years to undo this damage.
Yeah. I do want to get your quick take. We only have about 50 seconds left, but in terms of the supply chain that people do think will resume to, pre-COVID, you say what?
Well, I say no. I have a new book coming out at the end of November. It's called Sold Out, and it's on exactly this topic, Catherine, the supply chain. But in doing my research, I spoke to the individual who was probably the single individual most responsible for building the modern supply chain. It was 30 years from 1989 to 2019. It was head of one of the largest companies in the world, and this is what they did, among other things. And he said, Jim, you have to understand, it took us 30 years to build it. It took us 3 years to blow it up. It's not going to come back in a year. This is going to take 5, 10, 15 years to build a new one. So it's what I call supply chain 2.0.
So, Jim, just to pick up on your last point, if it's going to take years to bring the supply chain back to properly functioning, what does that mean for the everyday consumer in Canada and the United States? Should we be buying the refrigerator today? What does this actually mean in practicality?
Well, buying a refrigerator is a good idea. Buying a freezer might be a better idea. We're looking at for food shortages by the fall. Now, when I say food shortages in Africa and Middle East, this will mean mass starvation. You may see the greatest humanitarian crisis in history because they literally can't get the food. Everyone's like, well, gee, you can't get Ukrainian wheat. What's the big deal? Buy it from somewhere else. There is nowhere else. Canada and the United States grow an enormous amount of wheat, but we use most of it internally. And we feed, because it's not for humans, by the way, we feed our animals. This is how you feed cows, pigs. This is how you get beef and pork. This is an example of the supply chain, how it filters all the way through. So you would expect higher prices to persist. You would expect food shortages. Buying a freezer is not a bad idea. The future supply chain is going to be it goes by different names. Janet Yellen calls it friendshoring. Macron calls it constellation. I call it the College of Nations. But basically, we'll have supply chains and trade, but it'll be sort of members only. So U.S., Canada, Australia, Europe, others, Japan, will be invited to join, but not China. Russia is going to be in the waiting room for a while. We should be better allies with Russia, but the Democrats in the United States have pretty much made that impossible, at least for the short run. And then there'll be other countries that are kind of neutral in that scheme, Brazil, India, and others. But the point is, you'll still have trade and you'll have supply chains, but it'll be kind of friendly countries, members only, and exclude China. So that decoupling is going to go ahead. The Chinese seem to be not only fine with it, but they're actually leading the way. So, semiconductor manufacturing is moving back to the United States. The 20 billion of new semiconductor plants from Intel. And why is Taiwan Semiconductor spending over $5 billion to build new semiconductor fabrication plants in the United States? Well, obviously because they're worried about China. So we're reshuffling the deck, but none of this stuff is easy. I mean, semiconductor plants take 5 years to build. A new refinery, forget it. That's like 7 to 10 years. We haven't had one in the United States since 1977. So it's going to take a while to do all this.
So Jim, with that said, then, in terms of kind of what we're facing for the next number of years, what does that mean in terms of thinking about our investment portfolio? What do you think is the best approach here, a sound approach? I only have 2 minutes, sadly. So what do you think?
Well, we can do it. So if I say we're definitely going to have inflation, you would know what to do. You'd buy gold, hard assets, land, silver, treasury notes, government bonds, etc. If I said we're definitely going to have deflation, you would also know what to do. You would reduce leverage. You would have more cash, and there are other assets you could go into. The problem is we could have both. There's no question we have inflation right now. It's front and center. But if the Fed squashes it and causes a recession or worse, you could flip to deflation very quickly. So this is going to sound like an obvious statement. What you want is diversification. Sounds obvious, but most people don't know what diversification is. I see people, I've got 50 stocks in 10 different sectors. I'm highly diversified. I'm like, no, you're not. You have one asset class called stocks. Real diversification, have a slice of stocks, gold, real estate, cash. Agriculture is a good investment. Energy, forget the Green New Scam. That's a joke. Oil and natural gas are going to be around for a long time.
Okay, great. And then just one follow-up quick question. Given the potential outcomes, do you see one area that might present itself as a great opportunity? Or is it
Probably
energy?
oil and natural gas. I mean, if you, it's been beaten down, it's out of favor. They get the CSG nonsense. Larry Fink's trying to be Secretary of the Treasury, so he's using his $6 trillion or whatever to promote ESG. But if you actually understand the real science, global energy demand is going up faster than so-called renewables can replace it. So you need oil and natural gas whether you like it or not. The only other solution is nuclear power, but that seems to be out of favor as well. So you take, I always say when there's a narrative and a reality, reality always wins. So the narrative right now is get rid of oil and natural gas. The reality is there is no substitute. So that would be a good sector.
I love how you look at that, the narrative versus the reality. And here we are with a real view of needing oil. Jim, great to be with you. Thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.